Hey Flock, Mike here from Epic Duck Studios and welcome to another comic style painting tutorial. Today I'm going to be working on Captain America from the Marvel United box set by Cool Mini or Not. I'm going to be trying to capture the look of the card art as closely as possible, which means working in a lot of these very illustration style highlights, kind of almost cell shading, not quite, and I'll be working with a very saturated, simple color palette. I'm going to be using primarily P3 paints from Privateer Press here today, and I'll be starting with Signar Blue Base and Signar Blue Highlight for the blue parts of Captain America's uniform, and then finish it up with some Meritus Blue. Now, if you're not using P3 paints, whether you don't have access or just don't own them, any other similar colors will work fine. We're just looking for a nice saturated bright blue, and then working up into some sort of skyish blue tones. So you can pull any colors from your Citadel or your Reaper lines, etc. Just keep the general tone and feel of the colors the same and you'll be fine. Now with this being the first part I'm base coating, I'm less concerned with being really accurate. If I get a little blue on something that should be red or brown or skin tone or whatever, it's not a big deal to go in and fix it later. So this first base coat, I usually go pretty fast and kind of sloppy just to get the job done, because it just doesn't matter if I've got other things to fix. You know, my painting process here relies on very opaque, solid colors, and it really doesn't matter what's under them. You just build up until you get that solidness, right? As long as you get that opacity, you're fine. There's a little bit of blue on Cap's shield as well, just adjacent to the star. It's probably the easiest part to overlook when you're doing the blue, so just make a note of that. With the blue base coats out of the way, I'm going to work on some reds now. I'm coming in first with P3 Amethyst Rose, which is a fairly dark red. It's very comparable to Citadel's Corn Red if you're looking for a similar color in their line to work with. We'll build up on top of this with some brighter reds, such as Khador Red base. Now, because we're into finer details, there's a little more finesse involved here. You can see I'm using a little bit of a smaller brush, and I'm being a little more careful as I apply this, because I am working on very small, the little tiny bands around his belt as opposed to his entire chest. It's a much more focused kind of detailing. And it's, the little stripe across the chest here now as opposed to the whole chest. Every detail basically gets just a little bit smaller than one before it and requires just a tiny bit more finesse. So compared to the blue I worked with earlier, the red step is a lot more finesse oriented. It's all smaller details. They have pretty defined margins. We've got these round details on the shield. We've got the stripe across the chest. The little tiny fill-ins around his midsection and his back, and of course the Avengers logo on his right shoulder is going to be the smallest detail of all. Now for Cap's skin, I'm going to be using Cadian Flesh Tone from Citadel. Honestly, it's a very unrealistic, kind of peachy flesh tone, but because we're going for a very illustration-based style, it actually leans really well into that. In general, I don't love this skin tone, even though I do use it quite a bit. I usually use it to build up other tones, like I'll work in some blues, some reds, and things like that into the skin tone to give it more character, more depth. But in this case, we just want flat, comic booky, unrealistic skin, and Cadian Flesh Tone's really good for that. So it's worth noting this color you're going to want to use on his ears, his chin, a little bit around the eyes, but he's also wearing fingerless gloves, and I'll be honest, I forgot that when I first started painting this model, so you'll see me come back in with this color later on just to correct that. Go ahead and paint the fingertips now if you're following along. So as a base coat for the whites, I'm going to be using P3 Underbelly Blue. Now, Underbelly Blue is this is one of my favorite white undercoats, because it's got just a little hint of blue to it. It's almost a gray, but not quite. And it's going to help really tie the whites back to the blue parts of Cap's costume. So the really obvious white areas are the star in the middle of his chest and the little alternating inlays with the red across his belly, but he also has a bit of a sleeve that gets pulled out in white. And I start base coating it here, then realize the margins on the model are a little bit confusing. It's kind of hard to tell where the blue should stop and the white should begin. So I'm actually going to go back to the card art and kind of reference the different cards to pick out what I assume is the correct way to break this down. Now, it's worth noting that when you're painting a miniature, just do what feels right to you. Paint the miniature the way you see fit. If you want to make the whole sleeve blue just to get away from even doing this part, that's still the right answer. The next base coat up is going to be the brown on the gloves, the belt, the chin strap, the boots, and for all of that I'm using P3's Blood Tracker Brown. I really like this one because it's a very rich, warm kind of brown, and I feel like that's really suitable, especially for a heroic character. With, maybe a villain, I wouldn't want to be so rich and vibrant with my brown. I might want something a little more subdued, but it's perfect for Captain America. It's a very hopeful kind of brown, if that makes any sense at all. Next up, I'm going to tackle Captain America's belt buckle, the star, and one band on his shield, and then the A and the little wings on the side of his helmet. Basically everything else that's supposed to be white that I didn't get in the first pass, I'll be using P3 underbelly blue for this. Now, compared to Captain America's sleeves and midsection, these are much more fiddly details. They're all pretty small and delicate. The belt buckle is pretty easy, I mean, it's just a rectangle, but after that, everything gets more and more precise. You'll probably want to be using a finer brush for it, and just take your time, get it right. When painting this middle ring, I found it was best to kind of break it up into two jobs. The first was painting, as you can see here, I'm doing, the inner edge facing towards the middle of the shield, and I'm working my way all the way around. I'm really only painting about 50% of the way as I go here. Then I go ahead and basically repeat the process painting the outer edge. And the reason I'm doing that is I find I have the most control of my brush stroke towards the tip of the brush, and kind of what's happening underneath the brush, the sort of the footprint of the brush is a little less controlled. And so that way I'm letting that sort of like the footprint, the area of the brush that's making contact, kind of be in the area where it doesn't matter if there's a little overlap, if one white layer overlaps the next white layer. It's just a little brush control technique I use. I make sure that where I need the most precise edge is the edge being created by the tip of the brush and not the foot, I guess we would call it. Now, going back and repeating a color I've already done is going to be a recurring theme here. I realized I missed a little bit of brown on his chin. It's actually supposed to be a leather strap and, I guess, a leather chin guard. So that's all supposed to be brown as opposed to blue. So here we go, let's fix it. And similarly, when I was painting the captain's face, I didn't realize he had fingerless gloves on, so his fingertips never got painted to skin tone. Going back in, fixing that now. Maybe sometime soon I'll start painting new colors instead of revisiting ones I've already done. But we'll see. Surprise! That didn't happen. It's the return of underbelly blue for some more parts that should be white or metallic that I completely forgot about. Basically this time I'm going around hitting up some belt buckles. While I'm at it, I'm also going to use a little bit of underbelly blue as a base coat for Captain America's eyes. I like using an off-white, such as a light blue or a light ivory, as opposed to a white, because that way it gives me a little bit of room to add a white highlight later. Even in comic style, purely white eyes can look a little bit creepy. And we're doing more of an illustration-based style here, where there is a little more depth to the color. There's certain cases where it makes sense, like you're doing a fully cowled head like Wolverine or Batman, especially Batman the Animated Series Batman. But in general, you want to just have a little bit of room to add that little sharp, bright highlight to the eye. Oh look, more buckles. Who saw that coming? Yeah. Now we can't forget about the Avengers logo on Cap's shoulder here. This is a detail that's kind of got these little red insets and it's white all around it. The raised areas are white. They're also not raised a lot. It's really easy to accidentally fill in the red parts, so just proceed slowly and be careful. Cap has this emblem on both shoulders. The other one's a little bit hard to show you because it's kind of half behind the shield, so I'm just acknowledging it's there and moving on. Can it be true? Are we actually done base coats now? I think we're done base coats now. This is weird. I'm going to begin the highlighting process by hitting up the blue areas of Cap's costume using Signar Blue Highlight. Techless Blue is a good Citadel color for this if you're substituting that in instead. These highlights, I want them to be very sort of geometric, have almost a cel-shaded feel to them. So what I'm doing is I'm actually going around and creating the outline of the area I want to highlight first. So I'm working around the cowl, creating this sort of circular kind of shape that then on the right side of his head follows the flow of the cowl from front to back. I'm going to just take a moment here to appreciate the work and then just bump up the coverage a little bit by putting a second coat on really quickly. help give Cap a little bit of a serious scowl, I'm putting a highlight both above and below his eye. And what it's going to do is it's going to bring the brow ridge out a little bit, make it seem a little more prominent, and then just obviously make it clear that there's a little bit of armor under his eye, protecting his face, make him just look a little bit more grim, a little more determined. After that, we're hitting up the chest armor, and I'm actually going to drop the highlight to the bottom part of the top of the pec here. And the reason for that is it helps make the sharp crease there feel even more pronounced when there's a highlight above it and then the darker blue underneath it. So Cap's stance makes putting a highlight on the right leg really easy, but the rest of it I kind of have to just play with a little bit because his whole left leg is kind of underneath the shadow of the shield, but we don't want to just feel too flat. So on the left leg specifically, I'm going to get away with just one level of highlighting and maybe a little bit extra later just to kind of denote some of the seam work on his pants. But mostly what I'm doing is I'm looking at the way the leg is shaped, and there's some notable sort of planes where the leg changes. You'll see almost like a bit of a cuff where it then kind of faces downward. So I'm leaving that part very dark blue and putting the lighter blue above it. Cap's got a bit of a Ken doll thing going on in the crotch area, so I made sure to put just a little bit of a highlight there to give it a little bit of shape. By contrast, Cap's shoulders are really easy to figure out. They're just round circles that face upwards. Throw a highlight on the whole thing, let the sides be darker, call it a day. There's a little ridge across the back of Cap's helmet too, and I want to make sure to throw a highlight there so we just know that the shape changes. Highlighting Cap's back is pretty straightforward too. There's basically two blue areas to the left and right of the big buckle in the middle. Just highlight those and call it done. Sometimes when we're adding highlights, we add them to sort of accentuate the shape of the model instead of putting light where light goes. And this is definitely a case here where I'm putting this like half moon shaped highlight around the side of his head because the side of the helmet is very, very flat and then the top's very round. And I want to just really draw attention to that edge. Now Cap's butt is pretty flat here. It's kind of the butt equivalent of a Ken doll as well. I'm going to add a little more shape to it by just giving the highlight a little bit of an up and down curve. Just kind of, make it a little bit cheeky. This is America's ass after all. Unfortunately, I also went ahead and highlighted his left leg, the back of his left leg, but because of the angle of the shield, you literally couldn't see any of the work I did there. So here's the finished result. I hope that helps. So here's a seriously underrated hobby tool. This is a 0.5mm blue lead mechanical pencil. Now this is something I originally picked up for illustration work because you can sketch out everything you want to do in blue, then ink over it with just a regular black ink, and in Photoshop or another app, just drop the blue layer. In this case though, what I wanted to do was draw on where I want the bright side and the dark side of the shield to be. The part sort of facing down towards the ground is the darker side. And you can see I've just drawn like a crescent moon on there, and I'm using that now to guide where my highlights go. So all of the blue above that is going to get brighter, and the blue below it is going to stay darker. I'm going to do the same with the reds and the same with the white. Now for the next highlight on the blue, I'm going to be using P3 Meritus Blue. And this may seem like a strange choice because it's got a little bit of a teal to it. It's not quite just a nice progression into a lighter blue. But keep in mind, we are actually referencing the Marvel United card art here, and Captain America's costume in that card art actually does hit a little bit of a teal into the highlights, and so that's why I've chose this color. If you're not comfortable with it, if it just seems kind of weird to you, just use a lighter blue. Now you're going to see, for the most part, I'm going to be using this lighter blue as kind of a traditional GW-esque edge highlight. I'm really just going around and using it to really make those edges really pop. The only place I'm going to do something a little bit more drastic with it is here on this leg, because there's just a little bit more space to work with, and I'm actually keeping it to a tightly focused central highlight instead of hitting edges up, because there's really no edges. It's a big round surface. And similarly the top of his head, because again it's a big round surface, it doesn't necessarily have an edge, so we're going to be putting a spot highlight there instead. But everywhere else you can see the shoulders, the pecs, it's pretty much just an edge highlight going all the way around the model. So the helmet is the one place here where we're really more interested in creating expression than we are just putting lights in the right places. So you can see I'm really using the lines to sort of accentuate that eyebrow scowl that's going on. I'm also going to use this lighter blue to make that big bright spot on top of his head just a little bit brighter by basically dropping almost a whole circle here. It's going to just kind of overlap the edge of the cowl a little bit here, so it's about a 2/3 of a circle. Just filling that in, get a nice solid color to it, and then taper that down just a little bit along the edge of the cowl. I'm going to exaggerate the eyebrows just a tiny little bit more, and then we're done with this highlight. With the blue highlights out of the way, I'm going to push into the red now with some P3 Khador red base. Mephiston red from Citadel is a pretty close match. There's really not a lot of red sources that need highlights. There's these two little red stripes either side of the star on his chest, and you'll see I'm leaving the red darker towards the star, and that's just to make the star feel brighter by contrast. A couple little red stripes across his midriff, one in the dead center of his back, and then everything else is on the shield. So the red in the shield is going to start by following that crescent moon line I drew on with the pencil earlier, and then progressing about a third of the way up the shield from there. After that, I'm going to add a pretty typical edge highlight around both the inside and outside edge of each of the red sections, again tapering it so it's heavier near the bottom and kind of transitioning away from it at the very, very top. And this is going to give us the illusion of a sort of sky earth non-metallic metal done in two colors, where we've got now a dark horizon, a bright sky, which then gets darker as it goes higher up, and we get this sort of a nice fake environmental reflection. Now it's time to highlight the white parts of the model with P3 Moro white. Pretty much any straight up normal white will work just fine here. This is going to be a lot of very small quick highlights, so I'm just going to fire through them. You know, there's the Avengers logo, there's the star, there's the little belt buckles everywhere, there's the wings on the side of his helmet, there's the A on his helmet, there's the big buckle on his back, there's his sleeve, there's his little bands across his belly, you know, the alternating red and white pattern there. And then, of course, the star of the show is the shield. Now, the star in the middle of his chest I do with 5 simple highlights, because there's basically 10 alternating planes. The 5 points of the star each have a top and a bottom. So for the 4 that have upper facing surfaces, everything but the top point, I painted the top half in white. And then for the one that's facing straight up and down, I directed the white to the right side of the model, and that way it basically creates a line of action. It's kind of brighter towards his outstretched hand, and it kind of gives the idea of motion and movement. Now I'm going to handle the white on the shield very much the same way I handled the red. We're going to start by defining that, you know, horizon shape and then pulling the highlight up, leaving a bright spot that's about a third of the height of the shield, basically just matching what I've done with the red. The one significant difference here is I'm going to start to add a little of a highlight towards the top of the shield as well. With the red, I'm going to come back in and do that later with a brighter color, basically a pink. But with white, there's nowhere brighter to go, so I'm going to just include that now with this color. The star on Cap's shield is much more simple than the star on his chest, so I'm going to just go ahead and paint everything above that horizon line bright white, leaving the underbelly blue on the bottom half. Okay, so I mentioned a shiny spot near the top of the shield I was going to do in white. I didn't get there yet. We'll get there soon. First, I'm going to go ahead and paint that shiny spot in the red by mixing Khador red base with Moro white to give me a very vibrant pink. So I'm starting here at the topmost point of the shield and just doing basically a small edge highlight, and then highlighting the edge directly below that as well, just the opposite side of the red, and then just doing a little connecting line between the two. To give the shield a polished look, I'm also going to add one additional line between those two, edge highlights, just right in the middle, running in the direction of the shield, so a little bit like a radial highlight. I'm then going to repeat that for the inner red bands. Because it's a little bit narrower, I'm not adding that middle highlight though. And now using those two red highlights as a guide, I'm going to take a little bit of P3 Moro white and add that same shaped highlight to the white band of the shield. So I got a little carried away there with Cap's shield and forgot about a few details. So I'm coming back in now, adding a white fill and highlight to the A on his forehead and his right sleeve. I just straight up forgot an arm. One of the last details I need to visit on Cap here are his eyes. I'm going to paint in a pupil and iris at the same time using Signar Blue base. I find the eyes on the Marvel United minis are just a little bit too small to actually warrant paint and pupil in, so I'm just using a darker blue here that'll let me kind of do both at the same time. And using a little bit of Moro white, just adding that sharp little point highlight to the eye, just to the left of the pupil, make them look good and shiny. Now I'm going to add some highlights to Cap's skin using Citadel Kislev Flesh. If you're wondering why I generally use P3 paints, but I've been using Citadel for all the skin tones, it's simply because at the time I filmed this, I didn't own the P3 skin tones yet. I've since corrected that and have the full P3 paint set now, but at the time I just didn't have them on hand, so I used what I had. I really feel like having a bunch of different paints from different paint companies just puts more tools in your toolbox anyway, because they don't always behave the same. Alright, I'm almost done. One of the last details here that needs any attention besides the base and the blacklining is just getting some highlights on all the leather. There's the boots, the gloves, all the belts. It's just all over the place. It's all these little bits and baubles that we've already painted in brown. They all need a highlight. I'm going to use P3 Rucksack Tan for that. So this lighter brown is really just being used as a pretty traditional edge highlight. We're using it on almost all the outer edges of these brown areas to just really accent the edges, which will make them stand out even more against the black lining we're going to be adding later. Now I do apologize, I didn't get a really good video of either the left or right boot. One's blocked by the shield, the other one's blocked by his outstretched hand. I left a little bit of video in there, but it's not the best. And you're just going to have to kind of use your own imagination and figure out where you want to put the highlights there. Okay, at this point, Cap is more than table ready. You could field this and it's a perfectly good, valid paint job. That said, I'm going to put a little bit of work into the base and then come back in with some black line to really give it that illustrated punch. Now, most of the base is going to stay gray because it's, a chunk of sidewalk and that just makes sense. But I'm going to use some Steel Agent Drab to paint the exposed earth around it, and there's a few little clumps up on top of it as well. Okay, it's finally time for the main event, Higgins Black Magic. This is my all-time favorite ink for doing comic style lining on miniatures. If you can't get Higgins Black Magic, Dale Rowney FW Black works really well, Liquitex Carbon Black ink, and I've been experimenting with some Speedball Calligraphy ink Super Black as well. Seems to work pretty well, not quite sold on it yet. But Higgins Black Magic has just been a reliable tool in my toolbox since I really got into comic style work. And it's kind of true to form because it's actually used by a lot of comic artists for their blacklining when they're doing traditional, paper comic work. And so it's really cool in that we get to take a tool from comic work and bring it to comic style miniature painting. Here I'm applying it with a 00 brush. This is specifically a Game Envy Artist Arsenal Sable 00, but any brush that keeps a fine point is going to work just fine for you. I do prefer a Sable for this as opposed to a synthetic because I do find the inks do wear the synthetics out pretty quickly. If you're new to comic style painting, these Marvel United pieces are actually great for it because we're not doing a lot of volume building, we're not making a lot of shadows and stuff like that, we're not doing any hatch marks, we're just outlining. I'm just following the contours and the details that are already there on the model and just giving them an outline. Now the trickiest part here is probably this little bit here right around the eye. It's a little bit of finesse work, but outside of that, almost every other black line on this is just following a small groove between two details on the model. It's actually pretty straightforward, and it's a great way to get your teeth kind of into comic style work without all the freehand kind of texture building and shadow building that can come with doing a more full body comic. At this point, Cap is done, and I'm really just going to be adding some details to the base now. I mixed a little bit of P3 Iron Hull Gray with Mora White, just to get a bit of a lighter gray. I'm going to use this to just add some outer edge highlights to the rubble, sidewalk broken concrete thing on the base. This is pretty much just a typical edge highlight. There's not a lot to it. Next, I've added just a little bit more white into the mix. It's about 2 parts Mora White to 1 part Iron Hull Gray. Just get myself a nice light gray, almost a white. And I'm just using that to sharpen that highlight up even further. Just kind of hit the sharpest corners and really just sort of refine the look of it. Now this is a fun little exercise in brush control because you can see a lot of these brush strokes, I'm actually using the side of the brush as opposed to the point, where I'm trying to run along a big flat edge. To add a little bit of shading to the rubble, I'm just giving it a quick wash in Contrast Skeleton Horde. I'm using this because it's a pretty subtle color. It's not going to be as overpowering as, say, an Agrax Earthshade might be. And now with all those highlights done in the base, I'm coming back out again with more Higgins Black Magic and just using it to follow all the line work on the base. And with this being a chunk of sidewalk, they're pretty linear details. I'm pretty much just doing a lot of quick little straight lines. Because a large number of them are underneath the shield, some of it just didn't show up very well in video, so you just kind of have to fill in the blanks. One of the last little details is drawing a line around Captain America's feet where they meet the sidewalk, so it's very clear that he is distinct and apart from the sidewalk. And here we are, the very last step. It's time to paint the base rim. Pick your favorite base rim color and go to town. I'm using Citadel Corvus Black here, but I think you could have a lot of fun by making all the heroes have blue base rims and the villains have red base rims, stuff like that, which really fits the pre-colored plastic the game came with, but do whatever you want to do here. And there we are, Captain America from Cool Mini or Not's Marvel United in full illustration style glory. If you end up following this tutorial, I'd love to see the results. Feel free to tag me on Instagram, Twitter, mention me on Facebook, or share it to my Discord or pop into my Twitch stream. You can find me just about everywhere. Thanks for watching, and until next time, do something epic.
Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you enjoyed that one, please hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you get notifications when I post new videos in the future. If you want to take your support even further, you can do that at patreon.com/epicduck. Every little bit helps keep the lights on and the paint flowing, puts new models on the table so I can make interesting videos, and most importantly, puts a roof over my family's head and food on the table. You can also join me for live painting shows several times a week at twitch.tv/epicduckstudios. I'd love if you came by and watched the show sometime and followed the channel. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's supported my content over the years, both past and present. It's been an absolutely wild ride. And I couldn't do this without all the wonderful fans and flockers out there. The hobby community is just an amazing group of people, and you really make this worth doing. So let's just keep on doing this together, making more content, and just being fantastic together for years to come. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, do something epic.